Everything just exploded around Tina Campbell, and within minutes the entire conversation online flipped from admiration to confusion, shock, and non-stop speculation that nobody was prepared for. What was once seen as a strong, faith-centered marriage story is now being pulled into a storm of reactions, old interviews, and resurfaced moments that fans are suddenly looking at in a completely different light. And the internet isn't just talking. It's dissecting every detail like something hidden is finally starting to surface. Erica's reaction added even more fuel to the fire. One response was enough to turn a quiet situation into a trending topic, with people instantly reading between the lines, debating meanings, and trying to figure out whether there was more going on behind the scenes than anyone ever realized. Then Teddy's name got pulled back into the spotlight again, not through any official statement, but through resurfaced claims, emotional commentary, and online discussions that refused to stay buried. And once that happened, the narrative completely shifted gears. Now social media is in full meltdown mode. Fans are divided into sides, old clips are being replayed with new interpretations, and every post connected to the situation is turning into a new theory. What looked simple at first is now spiraling into something far more complicated, emotional, and unpredictable. But here's the question that nobody can ignore anymore. Was this just a private marriage story getting blown out of proportion online? Or is there something deeper that fans are only now starting to understand piece by piece? Because the more people dig, the less clear everything becomes, and the louder this situation gets with every passing second. The moment that wave of reactions hit social media, the entire discussion stopped being just about Tina Campbell as an artist and started becoming something much larger in the eyes of the public. It turned into a conversation about perception, relationships, and how quickly narratives can shift once the internet decides to focus on a personal story. At first, it was just scattered comments. People expressing surprise, others defending her, and some simply asking what exactly was going on. But within hours, those scattered reactions turned into a structured online debate, where users began grouping themselves into completely different interpretations of the situation. One group insisted that people were overthinking everything. They pointed out that public figures often face exaggerated narratives, especially when old interviews or emotional moments get resurfaced without context. In their view, nothing had actually changed, only the way people were looking at it had changed. But another group saw it differently. They argued that too many coincidental conversations, reactions, and resurfaced discussions were appearing at the same time to be ignored. Even though nothing official had been confirmed or denied in detail, the timing of everything felt too connected for some viewers. And that feeling alone was enough to keep the discussion alive. Meanwhile, Erica's reaction continued circulating across platforms, with users analyzing not just what was said, but how it was said. Tone, timing, and even platform choice became part of the interpretation. In the digital age, nothing is just a simple comment anymore. Everything becomes material for analysis. And then Teddy's name entering the conversation again added another layer of complexity, not because of any new verified information, but because the internet has a long memory. Once a name becomes part of a narrative ecosystem, it rarely disappears completely. It gets reactivated whenever a related topic resurfaces, even if the context is completely different. This is one of the most powerful aspects of modern online culture. Stories don't stay in the past. They remain dormant, waiting for a trigger that brings them back into circulation. As this situation continued to spread, content creators across platforms started reacting in real time. Breakdown videos appeared within hours, each one presenting a slightly different interpretation of the same situation. Some focused on emotional angles, others leaned into cultural commentary, and some simply amplified the most dramatic version of events to maximize engagement. And every new video added fuel to the cycle. Because once a topic reaches this level, it stops being controlled by the original context. It becomes a shared digital narrative shaped by thousands of voices, each adding their own perspective, assumption, or emotional response. What makes this even more complicated is how quickly audiences begin to accept repetition as reinforcement. When enough people say something feels off or different, even without concrete proof, the feeling itself becomes part of the story. Emotion starts replacing evidence in shaping perception. At the same time, supporters of Tina Campbell emphasized her long-standing public image, her consistency, and her openness over the years. They argued that jumping to conclusions based on fragmented online discussions was unfair, especially when dealing with real human relationships that exist beyond public consumption. This tension between interpretation and restraint is what keeps the conversation active. If everyone agreed, the story would end quickly. But disagreement keeps it alive, evolving, and constantly expanding. And as the debate intensified, older interviews and moments involving Tina Campbell began resurfacing again. Not because they contained new information, but because people were now watching them through a different emotional lens. A smile, a pause, a sentence, things that once felt normal were now being reinterpreted as potentially meaningful in ways they were never originally intended to be. That is how digital narratives evolve, not through new facts, but through new perspectives applied to old content. But even with all this activity, one thing remained consistent. There was still no single confirmed explanation tying everything together. No official statement changing the situation. No clear breakdown of what fans were speculating about. Just layers of interpretation building on top of each other. And that gap between information and interpretation is exactly where online chaos grows. Because in the absence of clarity, audiences naturally fill in the blanks. And once those blanks are filled collectively, the story starts to feel real even without confirmation. As the discussion continued to trend, people started asking a different kind of question. Not just what happened, but why certain stories become so amplified while others fade quickly. Why some reactions go viral while others remain unnoticed. Why certain names dominate conversations even when nothing new is officially happening. That shift in questioning turned this situation from a simple entertainment topic into something more reflective, a case study in how modern digital culture processes emotional narratives. And as more voices entered the conversation, one thing became clear: this wasn't just about one story anymore. It was about how stories themselves are built, shared, and transformed online. But just when it seemed like the conversation might settle into general debate, another wave of reactions began forming, suggesting that the public interpretation of this situation was still evolving, and that the narrative might not be done shifting yet. Continuing from where the conversation had started to stabilize into broader reflection, the online discussion didn't slow down, it simply changed shape again. What began as a focused conversation about Tina Campbell had now fully transformed into something much wider, a real-time example of how digital audiences construct meaning from fragmented information. And once that shift happened, every new comment, reaction, and repost started feeding into a self-sustaining cycle of interpretation. The interesting part is that by this stage, people were no longer just reacting to the original topic. They were reacting to the reactions themselves. Commentary videos were being dissected. Comment sections were being quoted as evidence of public opinion. Even opinion posts were being treated like confirmation of a larger hidden truth. It became less about what was said and more about how many times it was being repeated across different spaces. And repetition in online culture often gets mistaken for validation. That's when things started to feel even more layered. Because different platforms began developing slightly different versions of the same narrative. On one platform, the focus was emotional and supportive, emphasizing personal perspective and caution against assumptions. On another, the tone was more analytical, breaking down timelines and connections between resurfaced discussions. And on yet another, the conversation leaned heavily into drama-driven interpretation, where every detail was treated like part of a larger unfolding story. So even though everyone was technically talking about the same subject, they weren't actually having the same conversation anymore. That fragmentation is what keeps digital narratives alive for longer than traditional media cycles. There is no single ending point, no final version of the story, just multiple evolving interpretations existing at the same time. Meanwhile, Erica's earlier reaction continued circulating, but its meaning was being reshaped depending on who was sharing it. Some users saw it as a simple emotional response taken out of context. Others treated it as a turning point that changed how the situation should be viewed. And many people simply used it as a reference point for their own theories, regardless of what the original intent may have been. Teddy's name, which had already been pulled into the broader discussion, became even more symbolic in this phase of the conversation. Instead of being tied to any specific claim, it began functioning more like a narrative anchor, a point people referenced when discussing past tension, unresolved history, or perceived patterns within public relationships. In many ways, the individual context became less important than what the name represented within the discussion. This is a key feature of online storytelling. Names and events often transform into symbols rather than staying as isolated facts. As engagement continued to grow, influencers and commentary channels began responding to audience demand for breakdowns. Each breakdown attempted to organize the chaos into a structured explanation, but each interpretation differed slightly depending on the creator's perspective. Some focused on emotional storytelling, others emphasized media literacy, and some leaned into entertainment-driven framing designed to maximize engagement. Ironically, the more these breakdowns tried to clarify the situation, the more complex it appeared to become. Because every explanation introduced new angles that hadn't been part of the original conversation. Every timeline added more details. Every analysis expanded the scope. And instead of narrowing the narrative, the discussion kept widening. At the same time, audiences began forming stronger emotional attachments to their interpretations. Once someone invests time into understanding a narrative in a certain way, they tend to defend that interpretation even when alternative perspectives are presented. That's why comment sections became increasingly divided, not just in opinion, but in emotional tone. Some users were frustrated with what they saw as over-speculation. Others were convinced that deeper meanings were being ignored. And a third group remained somewhere in between, trying to make sense of the evolving conversation without fully committing to any single version of it. But underneath all of this, something more subtle was happening. The original subject was slowly being replaced by the process of discussion itself. People were no longer primarily focused on Tina Campbell as an individual narrative point. Instead, they were engaging with the way the story was being built, shared, and reshaped across platforms. The subject had become secondary to the phenomenon. And that shift is important because it explains why some online stories never truly end. They evolve into ongoing discussions about interpretation rather than events. As this continued, older clips and unrelated moments kept resurfacing, not because they added new factual information, but because they provided emotional texture to the conversation. A past interview here, a quote there, a remembered moment somewhere else, all stitched together by audiences trying to create coherence in a fragmented narrative environment. But coherence is not always possible in these situations, especially when no single authoritative explanation is available or being actively reinforced. So instead, what forms is a layered narrative ecosystem, one where different interpretations coexist, overlap, and sometimes contradict each other, yet still remain active in the same digital space. By this point, even casual observers who weren't initially interested in the topic found themselves aware of the discussion simply because of how widespread it had become. That's another defining feature of modern online virality. Participation is no longer required for exposure. Repetition across platforms ensures visibility. And visibility, once achieved, sustains momentum. Still, despite all the commentary, analysis, and emotional engagement, no definitive resolution emerged. The conversation remained open-ended, continuously shaped by new reactions rather than concrete developments. And that brings everything back to the central reality of the situation. In today's digital environment, stories like this don't move toward closure in a straight line. They expand outward, forming networks of interpretation that grow more complex the longer they exist. So even as some users began to move on, others were just entering the discussion for the first time, encountering an already fully formed narrative landscape and adding their own perspective to it. And as long as that cycle continues, the conversation doesn't truly end. It simply keeps evolving in new directions, shaped by whoever joins next. Everything changed the moment the message hit social media. Screens lit up, timelines froze, and within minutes, one name started trending everywhere: Joe Budden. Nobody expected it. Nobody saw it coming. But when Joe Budden finally broke his silence about the Stefon Diggs situation, it didn't just create headlines, it detonated the internet. Clips started circulating instantly. Fans replayed every word, trying to decode what he really meant. Was it support? Was it criticism? Or was it something deeper, something that had been building behind the scenes for weeks? Because according to insiders, Joe didn't speak randomly. He spoke because something had already gone too far behind closed doors. And just when people thought the story couldn't get bigger, it did. Social media erupted as old tensions, private conversations, and unexplained moments started resurfacing. Tweets from months ago suddenly made sense. Interviews were rewatched with new context. And every layer peeled back revealed something messier than the last. One insider claim suggested Joe had been sitting on information for weeks, refusing to speak until he saw how the situation would unfold. Another source hinted that what he knows goes far beyond what the public has seen. That's when the narrative shifted from commentary to something much heavier, something that felt like a controlled explosion finally going off. Then came the reaction wave. Fans of Stefon Diggs rushed to defend him, flooding platforms with outrage, calling Joe's timing suspicious. Others said Joe was finally saying what everyone else was afraid to say. The internet split in half within hours. Hashtags formed battles. Comment sections turned into war zones. Every new post made things worse. But the real shock wasn't Joe's silence breaking, it was what followed it. Because almost immediately after his comments went viral, another layer of the story surfaced: private reactions from people allegedly close to the situation. Screenshots began leaking. Voice notes started circulating. And in those fragments, a very different picture started forming. A picture where nothing was as clean as it looked on camera. One leaked message suggested tension had been building behind the scenes long before Joe ever spoke. Another hinted that certain people were trying to control the narrative before it exploded publicly. Suddenly, this wasn't just about one statement, it was about a network of reactions, cover-ups, and timing that didn't feel accidental anymore. And just when things started to settle, the biggest twist dropped. A short clip surfaced, blurry, incomplete, but enough to reignite everything. In it, voices could be heard discussing the situation indirectly, hinting that the truth isn't fully out yet. That single clip flipped the entire internet again. Now people weren't just debating Joe Budden's words, they were questioning what had been hidden from the beginning. Meanwhile, Stefon Diggs himself remained silent. No confirmation, no denial, no clarification. And in situations like this, silence doesn't calm things down, it fuels them. Every hour without a response added more pressure, more theories, more speculation. Then came the celebrity ripple effect. Other personalities started reacting without naming names. Cryptic posts, deleted tweets, subtle interviews where nothing was said directly, but everything was implied. The industry, it seemed, was watching closely, but speaking carefully. Joe Budden's original statement, however, continued spreading. Podcasts broke it down line by line. Analysts debated intent versus impact. Fans argued whether he was revealing truth or stirring chaos. But the most dangerous part wasn't what he said, it was what people believed he might know. Because once that idea takes hold, the story stops being about facts and becomes about perception. And perception online spreads faster than truth ever could. By now, the situation had evolved into something uncontrollable. Every new angle created another conspiracy. Every silence created another accusation. And every reaction added fuel to a fire that was no longer centered on one person, but an entire ecosystem of influence, loyalty, and hidden tension. Then, unexpectedly, Joe Budden's name started trending again, but this time for a different reason. A follow-up clip surfaced, showing him hinting that there was more to come and that people should wait before jumping to conclusions. That single line changed everything again. Was this just the beginning? Or had the real storm not even started yet? And that's where things currently stand, locked in uncertainty, tension rising, no clear resolution in sight. The internet is divided, The silence is louder than the statements, and every passing hour adds another layer to a story that refuses to stabilize. Now, the question everyone is asking is simple, but dangerous. What does Joe Budden actually know that hasn't been fully said yet? Because if this was just the silence breaking, then whatever comes next might be something the entire industry isn't ready for. Before you go, understand one thing: this story is far from over. What Joe Budden said was not just a random opinion, it was a spark in a situation that already had tension building underneath the surface for a long time. And now that spark has turned into a wildfire across social media. Everyone has an opinion, everyone has a theory, but nobody has the full picture yet. And that's exactly why you need to stay connected. Because in situations like this, the real truth usually doesn't come out in the first wave, it comes in the aftermath. The follow-up statements, the leaked reactions, the hidden details that suddenly surface when people feel pressured, that's where the real story lives. And if you blink, you miss it. So don't just scroll past this like it's another headline. This is one of those moments where everything can shift in a single update. One clip, one message, one reaction, and the entire narrative can flip again. If you want to stay ahead of the chaos, make sure you're locked in. Like this video so you don't lose track of the updates. Subscribe so you're not catching up after everyone else already knows what happened. And most importantly, turn on notifications, because when the next piece drops, it won't wait for anyone. And now we want to hear from you. Do you think Joe Budden is revealing something real? Or is this just another industry storm built on speculation and timing? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this debate is only getting louder. Stay tuned, because the next update might change everything.